Hello, welcome. My name is Kevin Swain. I'm the student president for the Buckley program. Before I introduce our esteemed guest today, I'm just going to say a quick word about the Buckley program. The mission of the Buckley program is to promote intellectual diversity on Yale's campus. We do this in a number of ways, including a speaker series, firing line debates, seminars, conferences, and summer internships for Yale students. Some of our past speakers include George Will, Mitch Daniels, Ben Sass, Ayan Hersey Lee, among others. You can learn more at our website, buckleyprogram.com. And Yale students, if you haven't yet, please see Hovik to swipe your ID so that we know you're here. Okay, now for our guest. Jonah Goldberg is a fellow and Asness Chair in Applied Liberty of the American Enterprise Institute, where he writes about political and cultural issues. He is concurrently a senior editor at National Review. A best-selling author, he writes a nationally syndicated column that appears regularly in more than 100 newspapers across the United States. He's also a weekly columnist for the Los Angeles Times, a member of the board of contributors for USA Today, a Fox News contributor, and a regular member of the Fox News All-Star panel on Special Report with Brett Baer. So please give a warm welcome to our guest today, Jonah Goldberg.
Thanks for having me here. Amazing crowd. Fake news will never report how huge this crowd is. So as you might know, I've been doing book talks a lot over the last 8 months, and I'm perfectly happy to keep it pretty informal with you guys, or we can do the straight formal affair. But either way, I'd kind of rather get to the Q&A as soon as I can, because I tend to find it more interesting in a lot of ways than saying stuff that a lot of you may have heard me say or have read in my writing or whatever the words are that are supposed to be coming out of my mouth. So anyway, as Henry VIII said to each of his wives, I won't keep you too long. When I first started working on this book, it was around the time that this guy, Roddy Piper, died. And for those of you who are too young to remember, he was a huge wrestler in the late 1980s. And he was also the star of one of my favorite B sci-fi movies, an early John Carpenter movie called They Live. And the most famous thing about that movie was probably his line where he says, "I've come here today to do two things, chew gum and kick ass, and I'm all out of gum." But I've probably seen that movie hung over since college, because like 4,000 times, and I never exaggerate. But it wasn't until a few years ago that I found out that They Live was not only a great B sci-fi action movie with a now largely forgotten professional wrestler as its star, it is also considered the single greatest Marxist film ever made by a whole bunch of academics. And this is not my sort of, crazy Twitter trolling kind of opinion. For example, there's a guy named Christos Kafalis who wrote in Dissident Voice, which I'm sure you all read. It's a radical newsletter in the struggle for peace and social justice. And he wrote that They Live is the Marxist movie par excellence. He adds that it is one of the most devastating and sharp criticisms of American imperialism ever made, representing in exemplary fashion the process of neoconservative barbarization in American society, as well as the dynamic of its revolutionary overthrow. Now, those of you who've seen the movie might be wondering why a movie about bug-eyed aliens taking over the planet is what they're really talking about. Well, the basic idea of the movie, I'm not going to dwell on it too long, I just think it's amusing, is that Roddy Piper finds these sunglasses one day. He's this bourgeois everyman, works hard, plays by the rules, just looking for a leg up. And one day he finds these sunglasses and he puts them on, and he discovers that the world around him isn't the real world, that the sunglasses reveal the truth beneath the superficialities. And so when he sees like a billboard with a beautiful woman in a bikini that says, "Come to the Bahamas," he puts on the glasses, and all of a sudden the world becomes black and white, and he sees the stark truth underneath, and the billboard says, "Marry and reproduce." And when he looks at magazine covers, it's all this stuff about behave, conform, and all the rest. Now, this is in a lot of ways sort of classic Frankfurt School Marxism, this idea that the world of capitalism turns wants into needs, luxuries into necessities, while at the same time constraining our choices to make us sort of like hamsters spinning a treadmill. And I think a lot of that is largely garbage, but it's really interesting. And the reason why I bring it up is when I was working on the book, I wanted a conceit that did something similar like those sunglasses. Because I have one of my minor obsessions is I like to sort of daydream about about the world today would somebody visiting from 500 or 5,000 years ago find utterly recognizable, right? We're all used to this idea of like, wow, someone from 1,000 years ago would come here, ooh, horseless carriages, flying, whatever, rising crust pizza, and they'd all be like really shocked by it. But what are the things that they would find recognizable? What are the things they're like, oh yeah, that's how we kind of did it? And one of the examples I often use is North Korea. We're used to thinking about North Korea and talking about North Korea as if it's the Stalinist communist country. We use terms like Marxist, Leninist, and all the rest. And the problem with that, in part, is that gives North Korea way too much credit. The North Korean regime has removed Marxist, Leninist dogma and catechism from their official documents decades ago. They don't call themselves Marxists anymore. They don't pay lip service to that kind of thing. They've created their own separate governing philosophy. And when you actually look at North Korea as it is, it's basically an absolutist monarchy. That's what it is. It's not the divine right of kings, it's the divine right of Kims, but it's basically the same idea. You have this family now 3 generations old where the patriarch, like if you read the stuff that they say about the founder of the North Korean state, it is as loopy as anything you would see from sort of the Code of Hammurabi. Right? When he was born in the mountains, night turns to day, unicorns go by, they get rid of the farting cows, whatever, I don't know. The second one, that's Kim Jong-il, right? Sorry, I've been day drinking. The second one, I don't know if you know this, but according to official state propaganda in North Korea, of the 18 greatest symphonies ever composed, he wrote 18 of them. He also supposedly in college, which he completed in 3 years, wrote something like 200 books and read like 900 books or whatever. I think he's basically like Dr. Evil from the Austin Powers movies. He claims to have invented the cheeseburger. Maybe not the question mark. So, but North Korea is more like a monarchy than just because of the leadership. It's a feudal society. There's something like 51 different castes and classes in North Korea. And if you were born into one of the low classes, which is usually comes from because your grandparents or great-grandparents were collaborationists with the enemy at the founding of North Korea, it is almost impossible to rise out of your feudal status. You are born a serf, you will die a serf, you're the last person to get fed when there are food shortages, you do not matter, you are expendable. And so at the top, you have an aristocracy of people who, because of accidents of birth, have inherited titles of essentially nobility. They may not call it that, but that's what it is. That would be utterly recognizable to almost every human being for the last 12,000 years since the agricultural revolution until a few minutes ago. And the more you look around the world, the more you see the world, the more that you realize that human nature is expressing itself in ways that are consistent with our historical past rather than breaking with it. Now, so the reason why I bring all that up is because the basic thesis of my book is simply this. Capitalism is unnatural. Democracy is unnatural. Human rights are unnatural. Poverty is natural. Man's natural condition is grinding poverty punctuated by an early death, usually from some bowel-stewing disease or violence. And so imagine if you were an alien from another planet, right? I couldn't come up with the sunglass conceit. So I did this alien from the other planet thing, which I borrowed, I believe, from a guy at Yale, Josh Green. Imagine you're an alien from another planet, and you're tasked with the job of monitoring the progress of Homo sapiens since we split off from the Neanderthals. There's a debate about when that actually happened, and it's always sort of cute when we say we split off from the Neanderthals, when in reality we wiped them out. And let's be honest, they had it coming. But call it, say, 250,000 years, right? So you're an alien from another planet. You have to come here. You have to monitor the progress of Homo sapiens for 250,000 years. But the trick is you can only come here once. You only visit once every 10,000 years. So on your first visit, you would write in your little journal, parked up in orbit, semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. Come back in 10,000 years, you'd write semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. No change. Come back in 10,000 years, semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. No change. Now, there'd be some changes in terms of migration and all the rest, but basically the natural human condition would be unchanged for your first 23 visits. On your 24th visit, you would see some amazing things. You would see the rise of the first city-states, which come from the rise of agriculture. You would see early metallurgy and maybe even some writing, and you would see some really fetching clay pots, right? You would see all sorts of interesting things. Wow, enormous progress. So then you come back on your 25th visit in 10,000 years. And before your ship could even make it into orbit, you'd probably be picked up by NORAD, and you might get here just in time to see, I don't know, like Miley Cyrus twerking at the Super Bowl. Which is to say that virtually everything that we associate with human progress has happened in the last 10,000 years. But that's misleading. That's like me saying that the combined net worth of me and Jeff Bezos is in excess of $100 billion, right? It's technically true, but it's leaving a lot out. The reality is that almost everything that we associate with human progress has happened in the last 300 years. And it happened once and only once. So for people love to talk about the Michael Mann, carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution, hockey stick graph that goes like this and then boom, takes off. And it's interesting. We can argue about it if you like. The much more interesting one is the one that shows that for 250,000 years, the average human being everywhere in the world, ancient Rome, ancient China, Mesopotamia, it doesn't matter. The average human being everywhere in the world lived on no more than $3 a day for 250,000 years. And then once, and only once, in all of human history, does it sustainably start to go like this. And it's been going like that ever since. And it's going on right now. We live in this moment, in the greatest moment of poverty alleviation in all of human history. We don't celebrate it. We barely even acknowledge it. The UN is about to get rid of the label of the term extreme poverty because we may literally eradicate it statistically from the globe in the next 10 years. And we don't celebrate that at all, which I find fascinating and bizarre and pathetic. And so why did this happen, right? And why is it still going on like right now? Well, first of all, it isn't the UN. The UN does some nice things, but this has been going on for 300 years. It's what Deirdre McCloskey calls the Great Fact. And it happened, my argument is that it happened only once in all of human history and in one place, in England. There is a good argument that Deirdre makes that Holland deserves equal credit. And we can talk about that if you like. If there are any Dutch jingoists in the room, I'm perfectly happy to talk about this more. But my argument is that it happens in England with lots of influence from Holland. Holland pulled off one of the great regime changes in all of human history in England, so, whatever. But I do not credit it simply to the Enlightenment, right? That is basically a big chunk of what Steven Pinker does. There's a lot I admire about Steven Pinker. There's a lot I admire about his Enlightenment Now book. Steven Pinker is a lot smarter than I am and knows a lot of things. But one of my criticisms of his way of talking about these things is he basically looks around the world and says, these are the things I like. so therefore they're from the Enlightenment. And these are the things I don't like, so therefore they're not from the Enlightenment. The problem is, first of all, there was no one Enlightenment. There were a bunch of them, right? I used to sort of take this line, sort of like from Mike Myers in So I Married an Axe Murderer, where he says, where I sort of borrowed from him and say, when it comes to enlightenments, if it's not Scottish, it's crap, right? I don't really believe that, but there are aspects of truth to it. Certainly the French Enlightenment, it was every bit as much an enlightenment as the English or Scottish or American or German Enlightenments, maybe even more so, and lots of really terrible things came out of the French Enlightenment. So just being glib about Enlightenment good, non-Enlightenment bad, I think misses some important points. But the Enlightenment is part of it, and I don't get worked up about this. I certainly think we live in an Enlightenment-based democracy and all of that. I call it the miracle. And one of the reasons why I call it the miracle is not because I credit God with it. In fact, the first sentence of this book is, there is no God in this book. I call it the miracle because we don't know. There are a lot, that thing about $3 a day for 250,000 years, there are quibbles about the math. But the basic point from left-wing economists to right-wing economists, basically everybody agrees on. The thing about where the Enlightenment or where the Industrial Revolution or where this miracle comes from, where capitalism comes from, huge disagreement, no consensus. The Marxists, actually there are a lot of different Marxist theories. The most famous theory is probably Max Weber's The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. There's a lot of merit to that. The basic argument of the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism, which Max Weber, people forget, rejected a few years later, was basically that these charismatic Protestant faiths came up with this new theological doctrine that said, basically, if you act like the kind of person who's predestined to get into heaven, you'll actually internalize certain habits of the heart that are more likely to make you rich. Delayed gratification, thrift, honesty, all of these kinds of things. I think there's a lot of truth to that. There are also a lot of problems with it. But whichever way you come down on it, it still makes my point, which was that this was an accident. No one planned this. No one said, okay, if we do these things, we will get this incredible burst of prosperity, right? That in 4 or 5 generations, we will have air conditioning and the internal combustion engine and all of these. No one planned this. This was purely in the Hayekian sense, something that we stumbled into collectively, an emergent property. And so part of my argument is that we should be really grateful for this, right? I attribute the miracle in part to borrowing from Deirdre McCloskey. She calls it bourgeois values. I call it the Lockean Revolution, but they're basically the same idea. It's this idea that our rights come from God, not from government. We are citizens, not subjects. We don't work for the government works for us. The fruits of our labors belong to us. The individual is sovereign, which means we are captains of ourselves, and that innovation is a good thing. For almost all of human history, one of the reasons why you get that hockey stick graph is that whenever innovation was given even the tiniest bit of free rein, you would see, because innovation is what really drives economic growth, you would see the line start to go up like this. And then the powers that be, the sort of North Korean regime of their age, which you might notice the North Korean regime is not a huge fan of innovation, would clamp down on it like a guild and crush any attempt to build a better mousetrap, as it were. You see this with the Chinese were way ahead of the West on all sorts of things, from the printing press to steel to ocean navigation and all the rest. But innovation is inherently threatening to the established order. It's inherently threatening to the powers that be. And so eventually that gets crushed and you get regression back to the mean. In Western Europe, innovation was literally a sin for centuries. It was the sin of curitas, of questioning the established order. And then for weird reasons, which you can find best reflected in basically Dutch painting, where for thousands of years, almost all European painting is pictures of like Jesus and Madonna. right? And then a few allegorical things that reference Jesus and Madonna. And then, boom, all of a sudden you have middle-class businessmen being portrayed. You have, the Dutch masters and all the rest. And it's because, for some weird reason, something clicked in people's heads and innovation was all of a sudden a good thing. And it was celebrated. And you have this taking off. There are other parts of English culture that have a lot to do with this that boil down into, so there's a term, I don't want to use too much social science, but the English are, in social science terms, weird. They had all sorts of quirky cultural habits that became only later sort of theorized and reified into abstract doctrines. And so one good example of this, as you can tell, I'm not really working from any of my prepared stuff anymore. One good example, one good illustration of this is the Fourth Amendment, right? So the Fourth Amendment, which says you can't have unreasonable search and seizures of your home or your property or your papers and all the rest, that can be traced to like the 7th century English notion that a man's home is his castle. And it was just this basic weird cultural norm that said the chieftain or the big man can't kick in the door of your thatched hut unless he's got a good reason. And over time, it enters Blackstone, it enters the common law, it enters the unwritten Constitution of England, it skips the pond in America, it becomes even more theorized, it becomes more sort of put in a centrifuge and purified, and it becomes this abstract doctrine. Another one is the idea of tolerance. If you read John Locke on his notes on toleration, or his essay on toleration, whatever it is, he has this great argument. He says, look, we cannot test men, we cannot put every question of conscience to the sword. We need to have freedom for individual faith and religion. And so these little, charismatic Protestant sects, they need to have some sphere outside of official doctrine without being persecuted. And so we should show them tolerance. But not the Catholics, right? They're dangerous and screwy, and we got to oppress them, right? Because they're basically like pawns of a foreign power. Well, this idea, the argument, the logic that's inherent in the Lockean argument for toleration comes to America. Jefferson takes it, puts it in a centrifuge, spins it around, and turns it into this argument where not only should we have tolerance for Catholics, we should have tolerance for Jews and pagans and Hindus and atheists too. And so this is how basically our civilization comes out of these cultural norms rather than out of a bunch of guys sitting on a piece of paper and using Cartesian logic, coming up with perfect principles. The cultural parts precede the abstract parts. And the reason I bring that up is if we don't have some appreciation for how bizarrely new all of this is, we will not have any desire to protect it. We will not have any desire to sort of say, hey, things have been going pretty well for the last 6 generations. And we will not defend these institutions that are the only things that have ever lifted us out of poverty as a species. People love to ask, why is there poverty? It is an idiotic question, right? It's like asking, you have to be too stupid to be a spell checker in an M&M factory to ask, why is there poverty, right? We know why there's poverty. Poverty is our natural state. The only interesting question is, why is there wealth, right? And there's only ever been one answer to this question, and it is this thing, right? The problem is that while liberal democratic capitalism is the greatest single cooperative enterprise ever conceived of or ever created to get people to work peacefully with one another, it has one drawback. It doesn't feel like it. It doesn't feel cooperative. It's like that old Ivory soap ad, 99 and 44/100% pure. You don't feel it. One of the greatest essays in the history of libertarianism is this essay called I, Pencil by a guy named Leonard Read. And it's written from the perspective of the pencil. And so it begins, I am an Eberhard and Faber #2 pencil. And the pencil goes on to explain how nobody knows how to make a pencil. right? The pencil manufacturers only know how to put together the last 1% of the process. The pencil explains, my rubber comes from Indonesia, my wood comes from Canada, my yellow paint comes from Delaware, and goes through all the constituent parts of the pencil and points out how people in different parts all around the globe, speaking different languages, worshiping different gods, can cooperate seamlessly to produce something as cheap as a pencil. It's this amazing thing. The British Museum about 10, 15 years ago did an exhibit called I, Toaster, where a guy made a toaster from scratch. When I say scratch, I mean scratch, like he galvanized the tin and he balkanized the, I don't know how you make a toaster from scratch, but that's what he did, right? And he like basically mined it all, minted it all from scratch. It was a really crappy toaster. And it cost like $1,500 bucks. Another guy did the same thing recently. You can find it on YouTube. I think it's called I Chicken Sandwich, where he makes a chicken sandwich from scratch. And no chicken or egg jokes. I mean, somehow he gets into chicken, he raises the chicken, he makes the mayo, blah, 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 blah. And at the end of the video, it's like, it's an okay sandwich. And it cost him a couple grand or something like that. So this gets me to the second part of my book, or the second part of my argument. And I'll wrap it up shortly. Because capitalism, the way to think about it, if capitalism and democracy and all of these things are unnatural, right? And they are unnatural in the sense that if they were natural, or if they were intended by God and the conventional narrative of things, you would think they would have showed up a little earlier in the story. But instead, for most of man's time on Earth, none of these things existed, which is why we were in poverty. And so part of my argument is that we have to be, one of the reasons why we need to have some gratitude, which we can talk about at the end again, is that human nature is very much just like nature. Nature abhors a vacuum, right? The second law of thermodynamics says that if you don't maintain something, entropy and decay will take over. If you read the Bible, if you read the Oxford English Dictionary, and you'll have a greater, read Shakespeare, you'll have a much greater appreciation for the word corruption. Corruption, today we talk about corruption as it just means bribery or graft and that kind of stuff. But it used to mean rot, decay, putrefaction. The concepts that we conjure when we talk about ashes to ashes and dust to dust. Right? That this is the fate of all living things, is that they return to the soil from whence they came. And so it's also caught up in concepts like, rust never sleeps. Termites don't care if you have an outhouse or a beautiful grandfather clock. They'll eat them both just the same. If you ever had a boat or knew someone who had a boat, you know that if you don't maintain it and upkeep it, nature will take it back pretty quickly. The jungle grows back. Or as the Roman poet Horace once said, you can chase nature out with a pitchfork, it will always come rushing back in. And so part of my argument is that human nature is like that too. And this is one of the reasons why I love like apocalyptic sci-fi stuff, and zombie movies and TV shows and The Walking Dead and whatnot. Because like the second the thin veneer of civilization is shattered, whether it's in Mad Max or The Walking Dead or whatever, human beings revert back to, maybe they still have clothes, but basically semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food, right? The normal preset software kicks back in. Prison gangs are that way too. You put people in essentially a state of nature, all of a sudden the coalition instinct kicks in, and people start banding up into self-protecting groups because there's strength in numbers. Read Lord of the Flies. You have these pinnacles of Western civilization, these little snot-nosed British boarding school kids, right? They're dropped off on an island without adult supervision. 5 minutes later, they're running around with war paint, they got spears, they're worshiping a devil god. That's what the Lord of the Flies means. It's Beelzebub, which is the Lord of the Flies in hell, or Cleveland. And so this is what I was getting about North Korea. North Korea began basically based on essentially derivative of the French Enlightenment ideas about how to organize the state and all the rest. But when you give people unchecked power, human nature comes back in. That's really what the phrase power corrupts means, is that when you don't have external constraints on the exercise of power, you start listening to your inner instincts, you start going with your gut, and you no longer like impediments to your will, to power, and your desires. And this gets to the point that, how to put this? Hannah Arendt, one of my favorite intellectuals, she had this great line where she said, every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. And what she meant by that was that, look, anybody who's had kids, which at least some of the people in this room have, you know that, first of all, one of the dumbest philosophical notions ever conceived of was the blank slate. And I think that Steven Pinker's book on that is great. Humans come into this world with all sorts of preloaded, factory preset software. But they need updates. This is one of the reasons why I'm a conservative. One of the fundamental insights of conservatism is that human nature has no history. If you take a baby from New Rochelle and you send it back 1,000 years to a Viking village and somehow it gets adopted, it will grow up to rape and pillage the English countryside. If you take a baby from a Viking village and you send it to New Rochelle and it gets adopted, it's going to grow up to be an orthodontist, right? Because the place where we get civilized, the place where civilization is a verb, is a thing that is an action, starting is the family. And then these concentric circles of civil society that shape expectations, that do the sort of stuff that Weber was getting at in the Protestant work ethic about molding the habits of the heart, molding our expectations. And when the institutions of civil society don't do those jobs, human nature kicks back in. This has been an utterly conventional insight, particularly about young men, for thousands of years. Poorly socialized young men, whether it was the Irish slums or the streets of ancient Rome or the Crips and Bloods in LA, left to their own devices, not properly civilized. They formed packs of guys fighting over territory and weird sort of masculine invested stupidities about turf and symbols of power. And that has always been the case. That is natural. It's amazing when you talk to people in the national security world, when they talk, I have friends who worked in Afghanistan. They go to Afghanistan and they try to bring Western notions of how aid and development and politics should be done. And they try to tell these guys, okay, now you can't hire your brother or you can't hire your cousin, right? You have to put this bid up for contract on merit or whatever. And they look at you the way my old basset hound would look at me when I tried to feed it a grape. You know, just sort of total unblinking incomprehension. And the thing is that the way the Afghans do politics is the way politics has been done for thousands and thousands of years. The ancient Roman society was built on various competing clans of families where they traded reciprocal types of friendship to protection and whatnot. That's that's normal politics. What we have is abnormal politics, and we don't respect it, we don't protect it, we don't take care of it. Instead, and so the reasons why I think this is happening, and there are too many to go into, I can't get into all of them, but part of my argument, which drove my publisher crazy, because they think, probably rightly, that the second you start talking about Romanticism, it's sort of like, you know, that biology class you have in college at 7 a.m. in February, and the professor says, the amoeba, you just sort of fall asleep. But what I mean simply by Romanticism is, part of my argument is that Romanticism emerges from the Enlightenment. It is a rebellion against the Enlightenment. It is this idea that you find in the Romantic poets like Byron, you find it in Rousseau, you find it in all these different places, of people rebelling against the sort of strict iron cage, mechanistic thinking of rationalism and the Enlightenment. And they want to instead elevate and honor the importance of your own instincts, your own emotions, your own passions. And so we don't talk about Romanticism anymore because that period that defines Romantic poetry or painting ended, but Romanticism never went away. And Romanticism basically just says, you're not the boss of me, my feelings are more important than your facts, this is my personal truth. And we teach this as a culture everywhere. We teach people that the highest source of moral authority is our own gut and our own instincts. When I was growing up, there was this awful public service announcement that played during Saturday morning cartoons, which said, "You are the most important person in the whole wide world, and it's you, and you hardly even know you." Which, like, when I hear that today, it makes me want to smash a guitar against the Animal House wall. But we teach kids, we teach as a culture, we celebrate it. And this is where the Frankfurt School Marxists are right, is we teach people that going with your gut, that going with your instincts, that following your own personal code is the highest form of morality. That has been mass marketed by big corporations and by the popular culture for generations now. I'm kind of obsessed with these SUV commercials. I see them all the time, right? And I don't mean the Matthew McConaughey ones, although if you watch those on mute, he does seem like he's a multi-state serial killer driving around in a Lincoln Navigator. But there's this other one where this guy is going into witness protection, and the feds are giving him a new identity, and they slip him, here's the deed to your new house, here's your new job, here's your new name and driver's license, and here's your perfectly conventional mid-market SUV. And the guy's like, oh, I can't do it. I can't. I got to be true to myself, right? Which means getting a slightly more expensive SUV. We teach this stuff as a matter of course in advertising to tell people, and in popular education, that conformity to moral norms or norms outside of yourself are somehow illegitimate. And this, in some part, is why we have the populism that we have today, is because everybody thinks no one is the boss of me. Everyone thinks that the best guide to truth are their own feelings. And this informs politics of the left, and it informs politics of the right. It drives a lot of the identity politics that we have today, because what we are doing is we are receding from this notion of neutral rules for a free society, and instead we're breaking up into different virtual sorts of tribes. And that is a form of corruption. Identity politics is, I'm not talking about ethnic politics, you know, like Italians and Jews and blacks. For communities to express their political interests is one thing. To reduce people down to simply an abstract category is a form of bigotry. To say that all I need to know about you is the color of your skin is a form of bigotry, whether I'm saying it about a white person or a black person. The oldest form of identity politics is aristocracy. The original aristocracies, originally aristocracy just meant rule of the best, which really meant rule of the strongest. But what happened was, once they had power, because we are hardwired to want to play favorites with our children, they came up with the notion of noble blood. They came up with the notion of inherited nobility, so that they could pass down their status and power intergenerationally for all time. So that if you're part of the ruling elite in North Korea, your kids will be part of the ruling elite. If you were one of the serfs, your kids will be serfs. That was true in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, ancient China, and it is true every society that gives up and turns away, gives into the corruption that is turning away from neutral rules for a free society. And when you don't enforce those rules, that's where human nature takes you. And so I'll just close with my, the only thing I'm actually going to read, except for that weird quote about they live. Before I was talking about how things start as cultural norms and then become abstract principles over time, you know, the Fourth Amendment thing and tolerance thing. The best example of this is the notion of human equality. When this country was founded, when I talk to college kids, one of the things I want to be very clear about is I don't want to whitewash, for want of a better term, American history or Western history. Slavery was a profoundly evil institution. But you have to think about it in terms of the context. I'm not trying to forgive it or minimize it, and there were special things that made American slavery worse than other forms of slavery. But slavery also existed on every continent and almost every civilization for the last 12,000 years. It is not natural to humanity. It's a byproduct, really, of the agricultural revolution, because when you live in small tribal groups, slavery doesn't make a lot of sense, except for capturing the other side's women. But the remarkable thing about the West isn't that we had slavery, it's that we ended it. And we should celebrate that. I want to teach the bad things, because you can only understand the good stuff if you understand how we overcame the bad stuff. And so one of the things, other than the objective moral evil of slavery, that made American slavery so special is how hypocritical it was. Rome wasn't founded on the idea that everybody is equal. Right? Bismarck's Prussia wasn't founded on the idea that everybody was equal. America was founded on this idea that everybody was equal. And we didn't live up to it, not just with African Americans, but with women and with people, non-landowners and all the rest. And so the single greatest thing that was ever said about the Declaration of Independence, including of the, and so this is an important point here, right? When the Declaration of Independence was written, the stuff about equality, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that we are all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, all men are created equal. That was basically Jefferson on a deadline throwing out some boilerplate. The exciting thing about the Declaration of Independence wasn't the beginning, it was the end. It was independence. That was the news. The beginning was just throat clearing. And then you have Abraham Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address, who basically takes that beginning and rewrites the narrative of America to say, no, no, this is the most important thing. 77 years ago, our forefathers came forth to breathe forth a new nation, and says that this equality thing is central to who we are. And this is a big part of Deirdre McCloskey's argument, is that our civilization is simply, at the end of the day, it just boils down to words. The story we tell ourselves about ourselves. And then, almost 100 years ago exactly, Martin Luther King, at the March on Washington, he says to America, he says to white America, that they are falling short of their own ideals, right? The great thing about hypocrisy is you have to have principles to be a hypocrite. If you don't have any principles, you'll never be a hypocrite, because you'll never fall short of them, which is one of the great strengths and superpowers of our current president. And Martin Luther King comes up and he says essentially to white America, you are falling short of the best version of yourselves that you tell yourselves. He says to white America that our forefathers came forth on this continent offering a promissory note that all men, including black men, are created equal. He wasn't making a sort of identity politics argument. He was making a universal argument and saying that we are falling short of our ideals. And one of the things that breaks my heart more than anything else is that on the right, I'm used to people on the left turning their back on this stuff, and I've been arguing with them for most of my professional life, that the right is turning its back on a lot of this stuff. Makes me want to take a bath with a toaster, which was the original working title of the book. So I'll just close with this. The second best thing ever said about the Declaration of Independence after the third best thing after the Gettysburg Address and the Martin Luther King's March on Washington was by Calvin Coolidge, praise be upon him. And on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration, he said, I'm sorry, I've been smoking a lot of pot and I have terrible dry mouth. He said, about the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful. It is often asserted that the world has made a great deal of progress since 1776, that we've had new thoughts and new experiences which have given us a great advance over the people of that day, and that we may therefore very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. But that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward. Backward towards the time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. Their ideas are not more modern, but more ancient than those of the revolutionary fathers. Francis Fukuyama got a lot of grief for writing that essay about the end of history, but in the terms that he defined it, he was absolutely correct. If history is defined by trying to figure out how to organize a society. Doesn't mean you're not going to have wars. It doesn't mean you're not going to have conflict. Doesn't mean you can't have arguments about the size of government. But these propositions are final. You can't improve upon them, at least in my opinion. And so all of these arguments that we hear today on the left and on the right about whether we should march to the right towards nationalism or march to the left towards socialism miss a point. We are at the top of the mountain. And when you start arguing about whether you should march left or march right, those directions are meaningless. The real direction you're talking about going is down, back to where we came, back towards the muck that we are all derived from and that we broke from once and only once in human history 300 years ago. Thank you all very much.
About 20 minutes for questions, so raise your hand and I'll give you the mic and we'll come around.
If you could make your question, make your statement in the form of a question, that would be great.
Yeah.
You pick them out. I don't care.
First, thanks for a great talk. Among the many things I really appreciated in that magnificent book was your call to gratitude, to put things in perspective and realize how extraordinary our ordinary day-to-day existence is in the scale of human history. What troubles me in all that is that maybe as an old guy, an outsider looking in, it seems that much of our liberal arts education, I see it with my son and his school education, there's so much of the opposite perspective. The system sucks. Rights are just a mirage for power. All that stuff that's taught really goes against the very sources of the things on which we rely for our prosperity and comfort and decency and honor. You know, the whole Western tradition, take down the picture of Ben Franklin at UPenn, et cetera. So have you given some thought, maybe this is the next book, how do we address this? How do we reverse this? How do we inculcate an educational paradigm where folks do put it in perspective and have the gratitude to preserve the things worth preserving for our own good?
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot, and I actually did a talk about education for Fordham and the Hoover Institution a while back for a book about some of this stuff. I mean, some of the answers are boring. Just teach civics. I mean, there's the Woodrow Wilson Center, which just triggers me because I think Woodrow Wilson was the worst president in American history. But they did a good thing. It's out there today. We were talking about it on Twitter. They published the test that immigrants have to take to become a U.S. citizen. And there's this data that is horrifying about how many Americans, particularly Americans under the age of 45, cannot pass a basic citizenship test that immigrants, I mean, like super majorities. And I took it today, and I got one wrong, and I was furious at myself because it was about, they tricked me. This thing about which of these groups of states were part of the original 13 colonies, and I messed up. Anyway, we don't teach civics very much. We teach social studies, which is a way of teaching people these grievance ideas, right? We don't teach people gratitude. We teach the opposite of gratitude, entitlement and resentment. And one of the examples I use when I try to talk about this is some of you may have seen the movie Goldfinger, the James Bond movie. Warning to younger people who haven't seen it, I rewatched it kind of recently and was stunned by how rapey it was. But that's not the important part right now. Goldfinger is this evil villain in the movie, and for the first third of the movie, you think he wants to rob Fort Knox. And then it turns out he doesn't want to rob Fort Knox. What he wants to do is unleash a dirty bomb at Fort Knox that irradiates all the gold in Fort Knox to make it unusable and incapable of being brought to market for like 70 years, therefore making his existing stockpile of gold infinitely more valuable. That is what Howard Zinn wants to do with how to teach history, is they want to take all of the gold of American history, or all the gold of Western history, and irradiate it. It's very much what Nietzsche talks about in the genealogy of morals. It's to take all those things that are considered virtues, turn them into vices. And that's what I was getting at about saying, you have to teach the bad stuff. but you have to put it in some perspective. The idea that slavery never gets smaller in the rearview mirror as we get away from it is incredibly pernicious. I'm not saying it becomes less evil, but the idea of the whole concept of intergenerational guilt, which is all woven into things like white privilege and whatnot, is incredibly pernicious. And yet that is what is being taught in all sorts of different ways. I don't have great answers to a lot of this stuff. The one public policy thing I really believe in is sending power down to the most local level possible. Because one of the problems that we have is we are now in a country where we define everybody who disagrees with us as abstractions and as evil. And that's harder to do when you actually live with your neighbors and you have arguments face-to-face with people instead of over things like Facebook, which is, you know, a garbage envy-creating engine. But beyond that, I'm trying to do what I can do, which is sort of make the argument, and hopefully someone smarter than me can take it someplace. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My question is, many people on the populist right have, I think, made the argument that liberalism contains the seeds of its own demise, and that the freedom that liberalism gives us is the reason why it kind of unravels. How would you respond to this argument?
Yeah, I think it's kind of weird because I think there's a lot of truth to that argument, and I think it really comes from Joseph Schumpeter, which is not to say that Sean Hannity got it from Joseph Schumpeter. You know, Schumpeter in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy basically predicts the ends of capitalism precisely because capitalism creates a mass affluent class. That this is sort of getting to the point about the genealogy of morals from Nietzsche, that basically what comes to be called the new class, where they basically talk us out of liberal democratic capitalism into some kind of managed economy. This is, you know, the first book, Suicide of the West, written by James Burnham. His more influential book was The Managerial Revolution, where he makes this argument, which was inspired by Schumpeter as well. I think there's a lot of truth to it. I think that we have been spending down social capital at an alarming rate, and when you gut institutions, starting again with the family, it becomes very, very difficult to fend off the deracinating and over-rationalizing and efficiency-mongering of capitalism. You need robust institutions. This is what my colleague and friend Tim Carney is arguing about in his new book, which just came out this week, where he goes and he reports on places that were resistant to populism precisely because they had healthy institutions like organized religion and whatnot. And this is why I think most of the problems that we have are way upstream of Washington. They get reflected in Washington. The problem I have with the populists that you're talking about, depending on which ones, was, first of all, I hate populism. Right? The only populist movement I've ever had any sympathy for were the Tea Parties, precisely because they were talking about restoring these founding principles rather than tearing them down. But historically, populism is inherently anti-intellectual. William Jennings Bryan has this great line where he says, the people of Nebraska are for free silver, therefore I am for free silver. I will look up the arguments later. Right? That's what populism is this idea that just the group is more important than the individual. Anything that stands in the way of our will to power is illegitimate simply because our feelings are more important than anything else. And so my problem with the populism that they're talking about is that their remedies actually lead to more of the problems that we're talking about, because populist movements almost invariably tend up to be statist. They want to centralize more power in Washington. They just want to be the ones with the power. And this emergency declaration is a perfect example of this. People who would be utterly horrified if Barack Obama did something like declare a bogus national emergency are like, well, it's great because he's our guy. This was the whole point of that Flight 93 election argument. And the problem is that the more power you vest in Washington, the more you centralize power, the more deracinating and destabilizing to settled institutions and civil society politics becomes. And so what you actually have to do is flip the entire thing and send the power out of Washington. And that's a very hard thing to convince populists to do. Yes, sir?
birthday. My mother's cradle tongue was French, and one of the embarrassments of my life was I never learned French. But I'd always run to her with my questions about French. I went to her one time and said, Mom, I know the term nouveau riche, newly rich, and what it means that people come into a lot of money and start acting that way. But what happens if people lose all their money and they become suddenly poor? What's the French term for that? And she said, well, literally it would be nouveau pauvre, but the French would never say that. And I was outraged. I said, what do you mean they would never say that? That's the word for what it is. Why would they not say it? She said, well, every language has kind of a worldview built into it. Mm-hmm. And in France, for most of its very long history, everyone's been poor, or most everyone's been poor. And so it was not noticeable, or you wouldn't comment on it. It was like water for fish. They're just in it. So I said, okay, fine, I get that, but what happens when what would they call it when somebody who's rich loses all their money? She said, they'd say they were formerly rich. I wanted to ask you, as someone who writes and speaks publicly in the English language, if you think that there's anything built into the English language that expresses a kind of background point of view.
Oh. I am absolutely positive there is, but it's, again, part of it is just sort of, it's a great question, but it's also a new question, and I have to do some thinking about it. But it's like asking a fish to describe water. Water just is, right? I do think, one way to illustrate this, which is, I will concede up front, is a bit of a dodge while I try to think of a good answer. I talk about it somewhere in the book. The way to understand the difference between the two Enlightenments, between the French and the English Enlightenment, is to look at classically English gardens versus classically French gardens. And the classically English garden, the role of the gardener is to create basically a zone of freedom where the plants can be their best selves. You're there to make sure that rabbits or poachers or whatever don't come in and muck with things, people don't steal things. But basically, you're supposed to let nature develop as perfectly as possible. The French garden is all of this Cartesian curlicues and corkscrews and weird right angles where they're trying to impose an unnatural vision of society on nature. And I think there's something deep in American culture in particular, where I thought you were going when you're talking about the nouveau riche. The classic question, which comes from Werner Sombart, a German social scientist, is, why is there no socialism in America? And the standard answer was sort of the Brycean answer, which was that we never had a tradition of feudalism. And so in America, there's always been this sort of, we don't see class the same way, much to the chagrin, I'm sure, of the English department here. And Daniel Borson has written some wonderful stuff about all of this, about how just sort of all the norms of the old world were shattered by liberal democratic capitalism and the way that people could make whatever they wanted out of themselves. And one of my favorite sort of examples of the differences here is, for years, particularly during the Cold War, conservatives loved to talk about these sort of natural experiments of East Germany versus West Germany, or North Korea versus South Korea, to demonstrate the superiority of capitalism over authoritarianism or communism or whatever. And those are all great. I love those. The satellite pictures of North Korea where there's like 2 lights on versus like South Korea, which is like a pinball machine, they're awesome, right? But one of the great natural experiments that people rarely talk about was the one that Seymour Martin Lipset talked about a lot. And I knew Seymour a little bit. He was one of the only people ever to be both the president of the American Political Science Association and the American Sociological Association. And he was a student of American exceptionalism. And he made the point that at the time of American founding, if you were a loyalist or a royalist, right, you basically moved to Canada or you stayed there. And if you were, and these aren't his words, these are Tommy Lee Jones from the movie Firebirds, but if you had your head and your heart wired together for some full tilt boogie for freedom and justice, you either stayed in the 13 colonies or you moved there. So fast forward 100, 200 years, 1970s, both the US government and the Canadian government at the exact same time. And remember, we're talking about basically the same genetic populations, at least among white Europeans. You have with remarkably similar cultural norms and institutions. Both the Canadian government and the US government at the same time announced that they were switching to the metric system. The Canadians were like, okay, right? And so now it's all kilometers and whatever and centimeters up there. And in America, it was like, get the fuck out of here, you know? That's witchcraft. We're not going to take orders from you, right? And that's one of the things I celebrate about America, is that we just have a different cultural assumptions about what the state can ask us to do. And it manifests itself different ways on left and right, but it's something that's sort of, that don't tread on me thing is one of these things that I love about America. And it's built in. How it expresses itself in language, I'm not sure, but I think that's sort of where I would come down on that. Anybody? This gentleman all the way in the back?
Loved your book, read it a few times. One of the things I really appreciated about it was that it felt, especially in retrospect, that that it was kind of at the cutting edge of some of these broad themes that you're talking about. You know, Senator Sass has written a similar book, and particularly I loved Sebastian Junger's book, Tribe.
It's a great book.
And would love to, you know, because I find that your book was maybe one, or at least according to what I think, it was one of the very first one that kind of hit on some of these broad themes. What do you think about some of these other books that have been broaching these topics?
Yeah, so it's weird. There are a whole bunch of books that came out that took different swipes at different angles for a lot of this stuff. The Pinker one was an obvious one. From a completely different but oddly related perspective was Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed. And then there's Hazoni's thing about nationalism, which I think has real problems. And then there's Ben Sass's book. Tim Carney's book is out now. Now, in some ways, Sebastian Junger, and if you haven't read it, you could read it in an afternoon. It's a very thin book called Tribe. And I learned an enormous amount. It was very helpful. I think this is one of those moments where a lot of people just recognize it's not supposed to be like this. And I don't think it's all Donald Trump's fault, right? I mean, it was amazing when I was, because of my opposition during 2016 to Donald Trump, there are a lot of right-wing talk radio guys who can't get over it. And so they were like, why did you write this anti-Trump book? And I was like, dude, I started it when even you thought this guy was a joke, and it begins 250,000 years ago. Not all of human history is leading up to Cheeto Jesus here, right? And but a lot of people recognize that there's something off, and I think there's a lot I actually agree with Patrick Deneen in his book about in terms of diagnosis of the problems. His proposed remedies, I kind of have no problem with, to some extent, have no problem with too. This idea of, he's very much in favor of localism too, which I think is, you know, as I've said, is really important. I think that, you know, it's weird. Every 2 weeks I get another book about nationalism, new book about nationalism hitting my desk, because people recognize that this is this thing that people need to argue about and question. And it reminds me a lot about a lot of the sort of 18th and 19th century, or 19th century arguments about what they used to call the social question. Right? This was in the teeth of the Industrial Revolution, where the social question, the Jewish question, was a subset of the social question. How shall we live? Because clearly the old world of divine right of kings and absolutism was crumbling everywhere. You had the Nietzsche guys basically, you know, officiating at God's funeral over here. And the question is, how are we going to have this sense of solidarity that we all live together? And I think we're in another one of those moments that a lot of people feel like we're missing something important, and we're all grasping, trying to figure out what the answer is. I know this is, it's like my friend Ramesh Ponnuru likes to say, of course I think all of my positions are the right positions. If I didn't think they were the right positions, they wouldn't be my positions, right? I think that at least some of my arguments are the correct ones in terms of understanding that we should have a sense of gratitude about this stuff. Where I really disagree with Patrick Deneen is this idea that 100 or 500 years ago people were happier, I think is just crazy. I mean, people don't understand that in America, 100 years ago, when we were like the richest society in the world, 100 years ago, it was natural for families to experience the death of at least one child. It was just a normal thing. Doesn't mean it wasn't a tragedy, but it was a tragedy that was commonly experienced by a lot of people. Calvin Coolidge's son was playing tennis on the White House tennis courts. He got a blister on his foot. It got infected. He died a week later. That was normal. And this idea that people would be happier if we went back to, time 300, 400 years ago, unless you just want to make the argument that ignorance is bliss and open suppurating wounds and no antibiotics and bad dentistry and no air conditioning and open sewage in the streets and babies dying all the time, if you didn't know there was if you didn't know about prosperity, you wouldn't know how that you're unhappy. I mean, there's a lot of really crazy assumptions in this idea that we should be purely resentful of technology. But I don't have a great answer about what happens next. I mean, the artificial intelligence stuff is real. Before, when I said one of the core assumptions of conservatism is that human nature has no history, that may not be true for much longer. If we can start really mucking around with the genome, we may be changing human nature in all sorts of fascinating ways. And as they say in the Godzilla movies, what could go wrong? So I don't know. I mean, of those books, I like Ben. I'm partial to Ben Sass. I like Ben Sass. I haven't finished Tim's book, but it looks great. My problem with the Hazony book is it's very interesting. I like his arguments about a lot of interesting stuff in there. But one gets the sense that basically what he is doing is he is taking all of Western civilization and bending it to an argument about why Israel should have maximum room to assert its independence or something. And I'm just not sure you can find that in Aquinas. But we all came at this from, it's like the men feeling the elephant. We all sort of recognize certain common things about our tribal natures, about the role of evolution, but we came to different conclusions, and I think that's a good process. I mean, one of the things I wanted to do when I wrote the book was model behavior that is sorely lacking on the right, which is actually try to make arguments where I persuade people who disagree with me. So much of what's on the right these days is this fan service nonsense, where they basically take transcripts of talk radio shows and say, wave this around on campus because it'll trigger the libs, or you'll own the libs, or their tears are delicious. And I find this stuff so exhausting. And so I wanted to make an argument that worked from the assumption that people could be persuaded, that left and right actually can share some assumptions about what defines progress. I don't know how successful I was, but I'm kind of proud of the effort, at least.
That's all the time we have. Thank you to the AEI Exec Board at Yale for co-sponsoring this, and thank you to our guests.